Astrology is not a personality test. It's a symbolic language. I spent years watching people reduce themselves to 12 boxes. I'm a Gemini, so I'm indecisive. Scorpios are intense. Leos need attention. The strange thing is how quickly people accept these labels. You wouldn't describe yourself using only one adjective in normal conversation. You wouldn't say, I am tall, and consider your entire identity explained. But with astrology, we've somehow agreed that a sun sign, one piece of data from the moment you were born, tells the whole story. It doesn't. Astrology isn't a personality assessment. It's a symbolic language, and like any language, it only becomes useful once you learn how to read its structure rather than simply memorizing its vocabulary. The structural problem with sun sign thinking. When you reduce astrology to sun signs, you're doing something similar to reading only the headlines of a newspaper and claiming you understand the news. The headline gives you something, a direction, a flavor, but it doesn't give you context, nuance, or the full picture. Your sun sign is one variable in a system of dozens. Your natal chart includes your moon sign, your rising sign, and the positions of Venus, Mars, Mercury, Jupiter, Saturn, and the outer planets. Each planet represents a different psychological function. Each sign modifies how that function expresses itself, and each house shows where that expression tends to appear in your life. In other words, the system has grammar. Planets describe what part of you is acting. Signs describe how that part of you expresses itself. Houses describe the area of life where that expression tends to appear. When you read a chart, you are not collecting isolated meanings. You are translating symbolic sentences. For example, Venus describes how affection and connection are expressed. Virgo describes careful attention to detail. The seventh house describes close relationships. When these symbols appear together, the pattern might read as something like a tendency to show care by paying attention to small details in relationships. This is not a prediction about behavior. It is a pattern that can be observed in real life and explored over time. This isn't mystical, it's structural. Claude Lévi-Strauss, the anthropologist who founded structuralism, recognized astrology in 1969 as a system of linguistic relationships that formed the basis of the manner in which language was used to comprehend the world. He wasn't a believer in horoscopes. He was interested in how astrology functioned as a symbolic system that humans used to think about complexity. That's what I mean when I say astrology is a language. The interesting question isn't whether Mercury retrograde ruins your emails. The interesting question is whether you can read the symbolic structures underneath. Why complexity matters more than prediction. People often approach astrology hoping it will tell them what will happen. They want certainty, a clear answer, a prediction they can hold on to. But the more complex something becomes, the less predictable it is. A full natal chart, with its web of planets, signs, houses, and aspects, is as intricate as an actual human being, and human beings resist simple prediction. You can't predict exactly what someone will do in a given situation. What you can do is describe tendencies, map potentials, and identify patterns that tend to appear repeatedly. But you cannot reduce a person to a formula. The same applies to astrology. Modern astrology has largely moved away from the old deterministic model. The idea that your chart is your fate and the planets control you like puppet masters. That version of astrology treated people as passive recipients of cosmic influence and left very little room for agency. A more useful approach treats the birth chart as a map of potential. The chart shows the symbolic terrain you are navigating and the psychological materials you are working with, but it does not decide what you will ultimately build with them. Psychological astrology, which combines astrological symbolism with depth psychology, frames the birth chart as a map of the inner landscape. Instead of focusing on prediction, it focuses on recognition. You look at your chart and notice patterns you have lived but perhaps never named. You recognize themes that have repeated across different stages of your life. You become aware of potentials that have not yet fully developed. In this sense, astrology becomes a language for describing complexity rather than simplifying it. Moving beyond stereotypes. Sun sign stereotypes exist because they are easy. They give people something to say at a party. They create a sense of belonging. They allow people to categorize each other quickly, but they also flatten the complexity of a real person. When someone says, I'm a Virgo, so I'm critical, they are taking one piece of their chart, the sun in Virgo, and using it to explain their entire personality. In doing so, they ignore the rest of the system. They ignore their moon, which might be in Pisces and drawn toward emotional fluidity. They ignore their Venus, which might be in Leo and expressive in relationships. They ignore their rising sign, which shapes how they move through the world. No one is only their sun sign. Every person is a layered combination of multiple placements that interact with each other through aspects, tensions, and harmonies. This is why two people with the same sun sign can feel completely different. The sun is one note in a much larger chord. In practice, the most interesting insights often appear in the contradictions between placements. Someone with a Capricorn sun and an Aquarius moon may experience an ongoing tension between structure and independence. Someone with a Libra sun and an Aries rising may constantly navigate the balance between relational sensitivity and personal assertion. These contradictions are not problems to be solved. They are the texture of a real personality. Learning to read instead of memorizing. When people begin studying astrology, they often start by memorizing meanings. Mars in Aries means this. Venus in Taurus means that. The 7th house represents partnerships. The 10th house represents career. Memorization gives you vocabulary, but vocabulary alone does not teach you how to read. Reading astrology means recognizing patterns. It means seeing how different pieces of the chart interact with one another. It means understanding that Mars in Aries in the 4th house will express differently from Mars in Aries in the 10th house, even though the planet and sign are identical. Context changes meaning just as it does in ordinary language. The word run means something different in run a business than it does in run a marathon. The surrounding context changes how the word functions. Astrological symbols operate in the same way. Their meaning shifts depending on what surrounds them. This is why I emphasize pattern recognition rather than rote memorization. You're not trying to memorize a dictionary of meanings, you're learning to translate symbolic sentences. And fluency takes time. You don't become fluent in a language by memorizing a list of words. You become fluent by using the language, making mistakes, noticing patterns, and gradually developing an intuitive sense of how the system works. Astrology works the same way. You learn by reading charts, observing how symbols appear in real life, testing interpretations against lived experience, and refining your understanding over time. What this means for how you use astrology. If astrology is a language, your relationship with it inevitably changes. You stop expecting it to tell you who you are, and you begin using it to explore patterns within your life. You stop looking for predictions and you start paying attention to tendencies. You stop reducing yourself to a sun sign and you begin seeing yourself as a full chart, complex, layered, and constantly unfolding. This does not make astrology vague or meaningless. In many ways, it makes it more precise. When you read a chart with attention to its full structure, you begin to notice details that simple sun sign astrology completely misses. How someone processes emotion, how they communicate, how they experience intimacy, or how they navigate responsibility. You also stop using astrology as an excuse. I'm a Gemini, so I can't commit becomes I have strong Gemini energy, and I'm learning how to balance my need for variety with my desire for depth. The first statement is fatalistic. The second is exploratory. The chart shows potential. What you do with that potential remains your choice. The core shift. Astrology becomes much more useful when you stop treating it like a personality test and start reading it as a symbolic system. The point is not to find a label that explains you. The point is to recognize patterns, tensions, and possibilities with more clarity. A question worth sitting with. After years of learning to read charts as symbolic systems rather than personality tests, one thing has become increasingly clear. Astrology becomes more useful the more complexity you allow it to hold. It does not simplify you. It reflects you. And perhaps that is the real value of the system, not in finding a label that explains who you are, but in recognizing a symbolic language that helps you see the patterns you have been living all along. What might change if you stopped asking astrology to define you and instead began using it to understand the structures you are already navigating? If you would like to read this, you can find the full article in the Celestial Letters blog. The link is included in this podcast description. This has been a Celestial Letter from Astral Moon Magic.